They were told they were going to hell. Oberleutnant Klaus Weber stood on the deck of a British transport ship, shivering in his thin gray jacket, watching the coastline of England disappear into the fog. He was a U-Boat Commander, a predator of the Atlantic, now reduced to prey. His commanders in Berlin had been very clear about what happened if you were captured by the British or their colonial lackeys in Canada. They said the enemy was a dying race, weak, degenerate, crippled by the Great Depression. They said the cities were slums and the people were savages. They said that German prisoners would be starved, beaten, and worked to death in the frozen mines of the North. Klaus touched the iron cross pinned to his chest. He believed it. He was a history teacher. He knew that civilizations rose and fell, and he believed the West was falling. He was wrong. Klaus Weber didn't know it yet, standing there in the cold spray, but the weapon that would destroy his Nazi ideology wasn't a gun, it wasn't a bomb, and it wasn't a torture chamber. It was a stick of butter. It was a symphony orchestra, and it was a train ride through a country that simply refused to hate him back. This is the story of 35,000 German soldiers who expected a prison but found a classroom. It is the story of how Canada defeated the Third Reich, not just on the beaches of Normandy, but in the cafeterias of Ontario. This is the story of the Bowmanville Redemption. Welcome back to the channel. Now, before we send Klaus and his buddies on the most confusing vacation of their lives, I need you to do something for me. My mother, lovely woman, makes great Nanaimo bars. She told me that a history channel about Canadians being polite wouldn't get 1,000 subscribers. She said, who wants to watch people say sorry for an hour? Well, look at us now. We are proving that history matters. But we need more recruits for the battalion. So if you want to help me prove my mother wrong, and let's be honest, who doesn't want to win an argument with their mom, smash that subscribe button right now. Do it for history. Do it for the algorithm. Do it before I send a flock of Canadian cobra chickens to your front lawn. You've been warned. Now, let's get back to the ship. The Atlantic crossing took 7 days, but for the 500 men in the hold of the HMS Duchess, it felt like a lifetime. Down in the dark, the air smelled of diesel oil, unwashed wool, and fear. Klaus Weber sat on his bunk, his knees pulled to his chest. He was 34 years old, an educated man from Munich. Before the war, he taught history to teenagers. He explained the Treaty of Versailles, the betrayal of 1918, the destiny of the Aryan race. He wasn't just a soldier, he was a true believer. He believed that Germany was the last bulwark against chaos. And now he was heading to the edge of the map, Canada. To a German in 1940, Canada was a myth, a frozen wasteland of ice and timber wolves, populated by lumberjacks and managed by the British Crown. They will send us to the nickel mines, a nervous boy whispered in the bunk below Klaus. My brother told me, they work you until your lungs freeze, then they leave you for the bears. Klaus didn't answer. He was thinking about the food. Just hours before, the British guards had served the first meal. Klaus had expected gruel, maybe a piece of moldy hardtack. That's what the German propaganda said the British ate, starvation rations for a dying empire. Instead, the guards handed him a metal tray heavy with beef stew. There were carrots, there were potatoes, there were 2 slices of white bread thick as a doorstop, and there was butter, real yellow, salty butter. Klaus stared at it. In Munich, butter was a memory. His wife Helga had to trade her grandmother's silver candlesticks on the black market just to get a tub of lard for Christmas. Here, in the belly of a prisoner ship, the enemy was giving it away. Why? Klaus thought. Is it a trick? Are they fattening us up? Or is it possible they just have so much of it they don't care? The doubt started there. A tiny crack in the foundation of his worldview, caused by 20 grams of dairy. Across the hold, 22-year-old Gefreiter Hans Miller was having a different crisis. Hans wasn't an intellectual like Klaus. He was a factory worker from the Ruhr Valley. He didn't care about racial destiny. He cared about his stomach. He had joined the infantry because the army promised 3 meals a day, but even the Wehrmacht was tightening its belt. His mother's letters from Essen were grim. Bread lines, empty shops, the taste of sawdust in the flour. Hans licked the grease from his fingers. He had just eaten more calories in 10 minutes than his mother would see in a week. He looked at the British guard standing by the door, a bored-looking man reading a newspaper. The guard wasn't skinny. He wasn't ragged. His uniform was wool, not the cheap synthetic blend the Germans were starting to use. "Hey," Hans whispered to the man next to him, "if they're losing the war, where did they get the beef?" The man next to him, a hardcore party member, scowled. "Stolen," he hissed. "Stolen from the colonies while their own people starve." Hans nodded, but he didn't buy it. You don't feed prisoners steak while your own children starve. That's not how war works. And then there was Ernst. Ernst Zimmermann was 28, a farmer from Bavaria, who ended up as Luftwaffe ground crew because the army needed bodies. He wasn't a Nazi, he was a Catholic, a quiet man who loved 2 things, his farm and his God. While the others argued about politics or feared the mines, Ernst prayed. He prayed for his wife Anna. He prayed for his 2 cows. He prayed for the soul of the British pilot who had bombed his airfield. Ernst was afraid of Canada too, not because of the mines. He was afraid of the godlessness. The party told them the West was morally bankrupt, a cesspool of greed and sin. He fingered his rosary beads. "Lord, let me keep my faith in the wilderness." On the 8th day, the horizon stopped being water and started being trees. The Duchess entered the mouth of the St. Lawrence River. The prisoners were allowed on deck in shifts. Klaus Weber gripped the railing. He had prepared himself for a landscape of ice and jagged rock. He expected Siberia. Instead, he saw a postcard. It was October. The Canadian autumn was in fire. The hills were blazing with red, orange, and gold. The forests were endless, thick and lush, stretching as far as the eye could see. "Trees," Hans muttered, standing beside him. "Look at the timber. You could build 1,000 cities with that." Back in Germany, forests were managed, manicured, counted. Here, nature felt infinite. But the real shock came when the sun went down. As they sailed upriver past Quebec City and toward Montreal, lights began to flicker on the shore. Street lights, house lights, car headlights moving along the coastal roads. Klaus blinked. In Europe, the blackout was absolute. A single lit cigarette could get you shot by a patrol. Cities were tombs of darkness to hide from bombers. Here, the cities were glowing. They passed a town with a brightly lit factory. They saw cars, dozens of them, driving casually along the river road. They aren't afraid, Klaus realized. They aren't hiding. It was a slap in the face. Germany was fighting for its life, huddling in cellars. Canada was leaving the lights on. They docked in Montreal. The prisoners were marched down the gangway, expecting a gauntlet of angry civilians. They expected stones, spit, screaming mobs. After all, the Luftwaffe was bombing London every night. Instead, the dock workers just watched them. Some looked curious, some looked bored. A few smoked cigarettes and pointed. There was no hate. It was just business. They were loaded onto a train, and not cattle cars. "Passenger coaches," Hans whispered, running his hand over the velvet seat. "Padded seats, glass windows." Klaus sat by the window as the train rolled west into Ontario. He counted the cars on the highway parallel to the tracks. 1, 5, 10, 50. In Munich, seeing 50 private automobiles in a day was rare. Here, teenagers were driving trucks. Housewives were driving sedans. "Propaganda," the Nazi officer across from him muttered. "They staged this. They knew we were coming, so they drove all their cars to the road to impress us."
Klaus looked at the endless miles of paved road, the telephone poles, the electrified farmhouses. You can't stage a continent, he thought. The train stopped in a small town called Bowmanville, just east of Toronto. The guards shouted, "Raus! Raus!" but their voices lacked the venom of the SS. They marched the prisoners through a set of iron gates. Klaus looked up, expecting barbed wire and watchtowers. There was wire, yes, but the buildings inside? They were brick. They were 3 stories tall. There were manicured lawns. There were soccer fields. It wasn't a prison. It was a boys' reformatory school that had been converted into a camp. Camp 30, the guard announced. "Welcome home, boys." Klaus, Hans, and Ernst were assigned to room 4B. They walked in and dropped their kit bags. It wasn't a cell. It was a dormitory. There were 4 beds, real beds with springs, mattresses, 2 wool blankets each, a pillow. There was a radiator hissing with steam heat. Hans sat on the bed and bounced. He laughed, a nervous, hysterical sound. "I sleep on straw at home. My mother sleeps on a cot in the kitchen. And I, the enemy, I get a spring mattress?" Ernst walked to the shelf. He took out his small wooden crucifix and placed it there. Then he turned to Klaus. "Why?" Ernst asked. "Why are they treating us like guests?" Klaus walked to the window. He looked out at the guards playing catch with a baseball. "Because they can afford to," Klaus said softly. "Because they are so rich, Ernst, that treating us well costs them nothing." The food was the final blow to their expectations. Breakfast, porridge with milk and sugar, coffee, toast, lunch, soup, meat, potatoes, vegetables, dessert, dinner, bread, cheese, cold cuts, tea, 2,500 calories a day. Within a week, the prisoners were gaining weight. The hollow cheeks of the U-boat voyage began to fill out, but with the fullness came the guilt. Klaus received a letter from his wife in November. It was short, heavily censored, but the message was clear. The RAF had bombed their neighborhood. The bakery was gone. Rations were down to 200 grams of bread a day. Klaus sat in the warm canteen, eating a slice of apple pie, reading about his wife's hunger. He felt like a monster. "I am fighting for the master race, and the master race is starving while I eat the enemy's pie." December 1940. The Canadian winter arrived, but not the killer freeze the prisoners feared. It was cold, yes, but the barracks were heated. The camp commander, a Canadian colonel, announced that Christmas would be observed. The prisoners were allowed to decorate. They cut pine branches from the woods. They made paper stars. And then the Red Cross parcels arrived. Boxes from Canadian families, people who had sons fighting in Europe, people who had every reason to hate these men. Ernst opened his box. Inside, a pack of playing cards, a tin of tobacco, a pair of warm socks, a chocolate bar. Ernst held the socks. They were hand-knitted. He could see the uneven stitches where someone's grandmother had worked the wool. He went to the camp chapel that night. It was packed. The Catholic priest, a Canadian civilian, led the Mass in Latin. Ernst knelt next to a Canadian guard. They both made the sign of the cross. They both murmured Amen. In the first time in his life, Ernst realized that the line between us and them was a lie drawn by politicians. In the quiet of the chapel, there was only us. But the true turning point, the moment that broke Klaus Weber, came in the spring of 1941. The camp commander had a wild idea. He believed that board prisoners were dangerous prisoners. He wanted to keep their minds occupied. So he invited the Toronto Symphony Orchestra to play at Camp 30. When the notice went up on the board, the hardcore Nazis tore it down. "Degenerate art!" they screamed. "Propaganda!" But Klaus went. He was a history teacher. He missed culture. He missed music. He sat in the front row of the gymnasium, surrounded by 400 other prisoners. The orchestra filled in, 50 musicians, men and women in formal wear. They didn't look at the prisoners with hate. They tuned their instruments. Then the conductor raised his baton. They didn't play Canadian folk songs. They didn't play British marches. They played Beethoven. The opening notes of the Ninth Symphony filled the gym. Klaus closed his eyes. Beethoven, the pinnacle of German culture. The Nazis claimed Beethoven as their own, a symbol of Aryan genius. But here, in a prison camp, it was being played by Canadians, by Jews, by immigrants, and they were playing it beautifully. The music washed over Klaus. It was perfect. It was full of passion and respect. He looked at the violinist, a young woman, focused entirely on the music. She wasn't playing for the enemy. She was playing for the art. Klaus realized then that culture didn't belong to a race. It didn't belong to a party. It belonged to anyone with the soul to understand it. When the final movement hit, the ode to joy, Klaus saw Hans Miller, the factory worker, crying openly. He saw Ernst Zimmermann with his head bowed, and for the first time in 5 years, Klaus Weber didn't feel like a German officer. He felt like a human being. When the music ended, there was a second of silence. Then 400 prisoners rose to their feet. The applause was thunderous. It went on for 5 minutes. Klaus clapped until his hands hurt. He clapped to drown out the voice of Hitler in his head. After the concert, the mood in the camp shifted. The wall of ideology had cracked. Now the prisoners just wanted to live. They volunteered for work details. Hans went to the kitchen. He worked side by side with the Canadian cooks. He learned English by pointing at vegetables. Potato, the cook would say. Kartoffel, Hans would reply. But it was the garbage that stunned him. Every day he watched the cooks throw away leftovers, meat trimmings, breadcrumbs, bruised apples. "Stop!" Hans yelled one day, grabbing a bucket of potato peels. "This is soup, good soup." The Canadian cook laughed. "It's garbage, Hans. We have plenty of potatoes. Let the pigs eat the peels." Hans wrote home that night, "Mother, you will not believe me. They feed the pigs better than we feed the general staff." Ernst was sent to a local farm. The farmer, Mr. Henderson, was a man of few words. He pointed Ernst to a tractor, a massive red machine. Ernst stared at it. In his village, 20 families shared one tractor. Here, Mr. Henderson had 2, and a truck, and an electric milking machine. Ernst climbed into the seat. He drove the tractor across the endless Ontario fields. The soil was rich and black. At lunch, Mrs. Henderson brought them sandwiches, ham and cheese. She didn't treat him like a prisoner. She asked about his family. "Do you have children, Ernst?" asked Mrs. Henderson in slow English. "2," Ernst said, holding up 2 fingers. "Boy and girl." "I have a boy," she said, pointing to a photo on the mantelpiece. "He is in England, flying a bomber." Ernst stopped chewing. Her son was bombing his country, and she was making him a sandwich. "I hope he comes home," he whispered. "I hope you do too," she said. Klaus found his battlefield in the library. The camp had a library with over 3,000 books, and not just approved Nazi texts. There were books on democracy, philosophy, British history. Klaus started reading. He read Churchill. He read Jefferson. He read the newspapers that the guards left behind. He began to teach classes to the other prisoners. At first, it was just English lessons, but soon it became history, real history. "Question everything," he told.
Not everyone was seduced by the butter and the Beethoven. About 20% of the prisoners remained hardcore. They were the die-hard Nazis, the officers who believed surrender was treason. They hated Klaus. They hated Hans. They called them traitors and Canadians. The tension in the camp grew. The hardcores organized secret courts. They beat up prisoners who were too friendly with the guards. In October 1942, it boiled over. The Battle of Bowmanville. It started over a minor dispute, the shackling of prisoners in retaliation for German actions at Dieppe, but it turned into a riot. The hardcores barricaded the mess hall. They armed themselves with table legs and jagged glass. They fought the Canadian guards for 3 days. It was a last desperate gasp of the Nazi spirit. Klaus watched from his dorm window.
He saw the boys he had taught history to, screaming, throwing rocks, clinging to a lost cause. He didn't join them. Hans didn't join them. Ernst was praying in the chapel. When the tear gas cleared and the riot was put down, the Canadian Guards did something smart. They didn't punish everyone. They identified the ringleaders, the hardcores, and shipped them away to a different camp in northern Ontario. Bowmanville was left to the moderates, to the men who had chosen the future over the past. 1944, D-Day. The news came over the camp radio. The Allies were in France. Klaus traced the map on the wall of the common room. "It's over," he told Hans. "Within a year, Germany will be occupied." Hans looked at the map. "My brother is in France," he said. "Do you think he will surrender?" "I hope so," Klaus said, "for his sake." Then came the reports of the camps: Auschwitz, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen. At first, the prisoners refused to believe it. "Propaganda," they shouted. "The British are lying." But then the photos came, the newsreels. The camp commander set up a projector in the gym. He made attendance mandatory. He played the footage of the liberation of the concentration camps, the skeletons, the mass graves, the ovens. The room was silent. Klaus watched the screen. He saw the piles of bodies, and he felt a sickness so deep it felt like his soul was rotting. "This is what we defended," he thought. "This is the civilization I taught my students about." He looked at Ernst. Ernst was weeping, his face buried in his hands. He looked at Hans. Hans was staring at the floor, white as a sheet. There were no arguments that night, no shouts of propaganda. The truth was too naked, too horrific to deny. The Third Reich hadn't just lost the war, it had lost its right to exist. May 1945, the war in Europe ended. Germany surrendered unconditionally. The prisoners of Bowmanville were no longer soldiers of a warring nation. They were just men without a country. The repatriation process began. But Canada offered a choice. Prisoners could apply to stay, to work in the fields, to build the roads, to become citizens. Ernst Zimmermann stood at the crossroads. His farm in Bavaria was in the American zone. His wife was there. But he had fallen in love with the peace of Ontario. He had fallen in love with a land where farmers owned tractors and churches were full. "I have to go back," he told Mrs. Henderson. "I have to rebuild. If good men don't go back, who will teach the children?" Hans Miller made a different choice. His family was gone, killed in the bombings of Essen. He had nothing to go back to but rubble. He applied to stay. He became a baker in Toronto. He married a Canadian girl. He never wore a uniform again. And Klaus? Klaus Weber packed his bag. He had 5 notebooks filled with observations about democracy, about education, about history. "I am going home," he told the camp commander. "Germany needs teachers, real teachers. Someone has to tell them the truth about what happened." The journey back was quiet. When the ship pulled into Hamburg harbor, the soldiers stood on the deck in silence. The city was gone. It was a moonscape of craters and broken brick. The smell of wet ash hung over the water. Klaus walked down the gangway. He walked through the ruins of his country. He found his wife in a basement apartment in Munich. She was thin, gray, aged 20 years and 5, but she was alive. Klaus didn't say a word. He just held her. And then he went to work. Klaus Weber was banned from teaching for 2 years during the denazification process. He worked clearing rubble. He broke bricks with his hands, rebuilding the city stone by stone. When he was finally allowed back into the classroom in 1948, his first lesson wasn't about the glory of Germany. He wrote one word on the chalkboard: Frage, question. Question everything, he told his students. Question me, question the government, question your beliefs, because blind belief is what burned this city down. He taught until he was 70. He never let his students forget. Ernst Zimmermann rebuilt his farm. He bought a tractor, an American one. He became the mayor of his village. He organized exchanges with Canadian towns. He hosted the Hendersons when they visited Europe in the 1960s. He never hated. He never spoke of the war with bitterness. He spoke of it as the time he found God in a prison camp. And Hans Miller? Hans died in Toronto in 1998. He left behind 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and a bakery famous for its pretzels. On the wall of his shop, there was a framed photo. It wasn't of a general. It wasn't of a battle. It was a photo of the Camp 30 kitchen staff, German prisoners and Canadian cooks, arms around each other, laughing. Underneath, in Hans' handwriting, it said, "The place where I learned to live." Today, the buildings of Camp 30 still stand in Bowmanville. They're abandoned now, covered in graffiti, windows broken. But if you walk through the overgrown grass, you can still feel it. The ghosts of 1941 aren't angry. They aren't screaming. They're humming Beethoven. They are the ghosts of men who came to conquer and were conquered by kindness. They are the proof that while you can defeat an enemy with bullets, you can only destroy an ideology with a better one. Germany brought war to the world. Canada brought them butter. And in the end, the butter won. It's easy to look at history as a list of battles, but the most important victories often happen in the quiet moments, in a shared cigarette, in a letter home, in a symphony played for a room full of prisoners. If you enjoyed this story, you need to watch our video on the Great Escape next, where things didn't go quite so smoothly. And don't forget to subscribe. We have a lot more history to uncover. I'm James. This is Canadians at War. And remember, be polite. It confuses the enemy.